August 13th, 2018, 5:27 a.m. A security camera captures a truck backing out of a driveway in Frederick, Colorado. The driver, a husband and father, leaving for work on what appears to be an ordinary Monday morning. But in the back of that truck lies a secret so dark, so unthinkable that within 72 hours, it would expose one of the most shocking family murders in American history. This is the story of Christopher Watts and the family he erased. Before we can understand what happened in that house on August 13th, we need to understand who these people were. Christopher Watts and Shanann Watts met in 2012 in North Carolina. Their connection was immediate. Chris was quiet, reserved, soft-spoken, the kind of man who seemed gentle and dependable. Shanann was vibrant, outgoing, full of life. She had dreams, ambitions, a fierce love for family. They married in 2014, and soon after they welcomed their first daughter, Bella Marie. 2 years later came Celeste Catherine, affectionately called CC. By 2018, the Watts family had relocated to Frederick, Colorado, a growing suburb about 30 miles north of Denver. They purchased a spacious 5-bedroom home in a new development. The house was valued at approximately $400,000. It had modern finishes, an open floor plan, a 2-car garage. From the outside, it looked like the American dream. Chris worked as an operator at Anadarko Petroleum, a major oil and gas company. Shanann worked as a sales representative for Lavelle, a multi-level marketing company that sold health and wellness products. She was passionate about her work. She believed in the products. She shared her life openly on social media, posting videos of family trips, birthday parties, everyday moments with her girls. To anyone scrolling through her Facebook page, the Watts family seemed perfect, but perfection, as it turned out, was an illusion. Behind closed doors, the couple was drowning in debt. In 2015, they had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy protection. Their liabilities totaled nearly $450,000, credit card debt, medical bills, mortgage payments they couldn't keep up with. Despite earning a combined income of roughly $100,000 per year, they were living beyond their means. The financial strain created tension, arguments, resentment, but even with these struggles, no one, not their friends, not their family, not their neighbors, could have imagined what Chris Watts was capable of, because the man everyone thought they knew was hiding a darkness that no one saw coming. In early August 2018, Shanann traveled to Arizona for a work trip with Lavelle. It was a company retreat, an opportunity for sales representatives to network, attend seminars, and celebrate their achievements. She brought Bella and CC with her. Chris stayed behind in Colorado, working his shifts at Anadarko. During that week, something shifted. Shanann later confided in friends that she felt a distance between herself and Chris. He seemed distracted, uninterested. When she tried to talk to him on the phone, the conversations felt cold, disconnected. She worried about their marriage. She wondered if they were drifting apart. What Shanann didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that while she was in Arizona trying to save their relationship, Chris was with another woman. Her name was Nico. She was a co-worker at Anadarko Petroleum, and she had no idea that Chris Watts was still very much a married man with a family. Chris had told Nico that he was separated, that his divorce was nearly finalized, that he was moving on with his life. It was all a lie, but Nico believed him. And for those few weeks in the summer of 2018, Chris Watts lived a double life, playing the role of family man at home while pursuing a relationship with Nico in secret. On the night of August 12th, Shanann's flight landed in Denver. Her friend and co-worker, Nico, picked her up from the airport and drove her home to Frederick. Security footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera captured the moment Shanann arrived at her house. It was approximately 2 a.m. on August 13th. Nico helped her bring her luggage inside. They talked briefly. Then Nico left. Shanann walked into her home. She went upstairs. She climbed into bed next to her husband. She would never leave that house alive. Monday, August 13th, 2018. Shanann had a prenatal doctor's appointment scheduled for that afternoon. She was 15 weeks pregnant with a boy, a son she and Chris had already named Nico, but she never showed up. Nicole Atkinson, the same friend who had dropped Shanann off just hours earlier, tried calling her. No answer. She sent text messages. No response. This wasn't like Shanann. She was organized, punctual. She didn't miss appointments. And she always responded to messages. By early afternoon, Nicole's concern turned to alarm. She called Chris at work and told him she couldn't reach Shanann. Chris seemed unconcerned. He suggested maybe she was sleeping. Maybe she'd gone to a friend's house, but Nicole didn't buy it. Something felt wrong. She drove to the Watts residence. She knocked on the door, no answer. She peered through the windows. The house was silent, empty. Chris gave her permission to check inside. Nicole used the garage code to enter, and what she found made her heart sink. Shannon's car was in the garage untouched. Inside the house, her purse sat on the kitchen counter. Her phone was inside. Her keys, her wallet, her lupus medication, something she needed to take daily. Shanann would never leave without those things. Nicole went upstairs. She checked the bedrooms. No one was there, but on the bed in the master bedroom, she found Shannon's wedding ring. At 1:40 p.m., Nicole called 911. She told the dispatcher that her friend and her friend's 2 daughters were missing, that their car was at home, that all of their belongings were still in the house. That something was very, very wrong. Within minutes, officers from the Frederick Police Department arrived at the scene, and the investigation into the disappearance of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste Watts officially began. When police interviewed Chris Watts that afternoon, he appeared calm, cooperative, even helpful. He told officers that he'd last seen his wife and daughters at 5:15 that morning. He said Shanann had been in bed when he left for work. He claimed everything seemed normal. He said she'd mentioned something about taking the girls to a friend's house for a playdate, but investigators immediately noticed red flags. First, if Shanann had plans to take the girls somewhere, why was her car still in the garage? Why was her purse, her phone, and her medication all left behind? Second, Chris's demeanor seemed off. He wasn't frantic. He wasn't panicking. For a man whose pregnant wife and 2 young children had just vanished, he seemed strangely composed. Still, at this stage, Chris was not considered a suspect. He was a concerned husband, a worried father, and he played the part convincingly. That evening, Chris appeared on local television news. He stood in front of his home, cameras rolling, and made a public plea for the safe return of his family. His voice was soft, shaky at times. He said he just wanted them to come home. He said he missed them. He said he had no idea where they could be. It was a performance, and for a brief moment, it worked. But behind the scenes, detectives were already pulling phone records, checking security footage, interviewing coworkers and friends, and the cracks in Chris Watts' story were beginning to show. Within 24 hours of the disappearance, investigators uncovered something Chris had desperately tried to hide. He was having an affair. Phone records revealed months of communication between Chris and a woman named Nicole Kessinger. Text messages, photos, GPS data showing they'd been meeting in secret. Nicole worked at Anadarko Petroleum, the same company where Chris was employed. The relationship had started in early summer. By August, it had become serious. But here's what made it even more damning. Nicole had been searching the internet for wedding dresses. She'd been looking at homes. She'd been planning a future with Chris Watts. She genuinely believed he was separated, that his marriage was over, that he was a single father in the process of getting a divorce. When police contacted Nico on August 15th, she was blindsided. She had no idea Shanann was still living in the home, no idea she was pregnant, no idea that Chris had been lying to her about everything. Nico cooperated fully with investigators. She handed over her phone. She provided text messages, photos, and a detailed timeline of the relationship. And she told them something critical. Just days before Shanann disappeared, Chris had told Nico that his divorce would be finalized soon, that he was ready to move on, that he wanted to start a new life. For investigators, the pieces were falling into place. Chris Watts had a motive. He wanted his family gone. He wanted to be free. He wanted to start over with Nico. And now his wife and daughters were missing. On August 15th, just 2 days after Shanann and the girls vanished, investigators asked Chris Watts to take a polygraph test. A polygraph measures physiological responses: heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, skin conductivity. It's not perfect. It's not admissible in court, but it can be a powerful investigative tool. Chris agreed to the test, and he failed, catastrophically. The examiner later described it as one of the lowest scores he'd ever seen. Every question about his involvement in the disappearance triggered massive physiological responses. His body was screaming what his mouth refused to say. Confronted with the results, Chris began to waver. Investigators pressed him. They told him they knew about the affair. They told him the evidence was mounting. They told him it was time to tell the truth. And then, Chris's father, Ronnie Watts, arrived at the police station. In a private room, away from the detectives, Chris finally broke down. He confessed to killing Shanann, but the story he told was calculated, strategic, designed to shift blame. He claimed that he'd woken up early on August 13th and told Shanann he wanted a separation. He said she became emotional, angry. He said he went downstairs and watched the baby monitor. And then he claimed he saw Shanann smothering Bella and CC in their beds. He said she was killing their daughters in retaliation for his request to separate. He said he ran upstairs and strangled Shanann in a fit of rage to stop her. It was a lie meant to paint him as a grieving father who'd lost control in a moment of horror. But investigators didn't believe it, because the evidence, the timeline, the forensics, the behavior, didn't match his story. Chris Watts wasn't a man who'd snapped in a moment of passion. He was a man who'd planned this. On August 16th, 2018, Chris Watts led police to the bodies. The location was a remote oil field in Weld County, Colorado, property owned by Anadarko Petroleum, the company where Chris worked. It was an area he knew well, an area he had access to, an area where he thought no one would ever look. Investigators arrived at the site early in the morning. Chris directed them to a patch of disturbed earth near an oil well. They began to dig, and within minutes, they found Shanann. Her body had been buried in a shallow grave, hastily covered with dirt and debris. She was still wearing the shirt she'd worn to bed. Her hands showed signs of defensive wounds. The autopsy would later confirm she'd been manually strangled. Her unborn son, Nico, had died with her. But Bella and CC were not in the grave. Chris told investigators where to look next. 2 oil tanks stood nearby, tall, cylindrical structures used to store crude oil. Each had a narrow opening at the top, just 8 inches in diameter. Chris admitted he'd placed his daughter's bodies inside. Recovery teams climbed the tanks. They opened the hatches, and what they found was beyond comprehension. Bella and CC, 2 little girls who should have been starting preschool, who should have been playing with toys, who should have had their whole lives ahead of them, had been stuffed through those narrow openings and submerged in crude oil. The investigators who recovered their bodies would later describe it as one of the most traumatic scenes they'd ever witnessed. Bella was 4 years old, CC was 3, and their father, the man who should have protected them, had murdered them and disposed of their bodies like garbage. For weeks after his arrest, Chris Watts maintained his original story. He insisted that Shanann had killed the girls, that he'd only killed Shanann in response. But in February 2019, months after his sentencing, Chris sat down for a 5-hour interview with investigators at the Dodge Correctional Institution in Wisconsin. And for the first time, he told the truth. The real story was far worse than anyone had imagined. Chris admitted that on the night of August 12th, while Shanann was flying home from Arizona, he'd made his decision. He was going to kill her. He was going to kill his daughters. He was going to erase his family. When Shanann arrived home at 2 a.m., she went to bed. She fell asleep next to him. And sometime in the early morning hours of August 13th, Chris strangled her. She fought back. She struggled. She scratched at his hands and arms, but eventually, she stopped moving. Chris then carried Shannon's body downstairs and loaded it into the back of his truck. But Bella and CC were still alive. He went into their bedrooms. He woke them up. He told them they were going on an adventure. He buckled them into the back seat of his truck. They had no idea their mother's body was in the truck bed just behind them. Chris drove to the oil field, a 45-minute drive in the dark. Bella and CC sat quietly in the back seat. At one point, CC asked, "Where's Mommy?" Chris lied. He said she'd meet them later. When they arrived at the site, Chris unloaded Shannon's body and began digging a grave. And then Bella saw her. She saw her mother's body on the ground. She started crying. She asked what was wrong with Mommy, and Chris made his choice. He put CC back in the truck. He took Bella aside, and he smothered her with a blanket. She fought. She begged him to stop. She said, "Daddy, no." But he didn't stop. When Bella stopped breathing, Chris carried her small body to one of the oil tanks and pushed her through the opening. Then he went back to the truck. CC was still alive, still waiting. He smothered her too, and then he placed her body in the second oil tank. By the time the sun rose on August 13th, 2018, Shanann, Bella, CC, and Nico were all gone, and Chris Watts drove to work like it was just another day. On November 6, 2018, Christopher Lee Watts stood before a judge in Weld County, Colorado. He pleaded guilty to 9 charges: 3 counts of first-degree murder, Shanann, Bella, and Celeste; 2 counts of murdering a child under 12, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. He accepted a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. Shannon's family, her parents, Frank and Sandra Arzusek, had requested it. They didn't want years of trials and appeals. They didn't want to relive the horror over and over again in court. They wanted closure. On November 19, 2018, Chris Watts was sentenced. 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole, 3 to be served consecutively, 2 concurrently. An additional 48 years for the unlawful termination of Shannon's pregnancy. 36 years for tampering with the bodies. The judge called it the most inhumane and vicious crime he had ever seen. Shannon's father, Frank Arzusek, addressed the court. He looked directly at Chris and called him a heartless monster. Chris showed no emotion. He was then transferred to the Dodge Correctional Institution in Waupun, Wisconsin, a maximum security facility for his own safety. Inmates don't take kindly to men who murder children. He will spend the rest of his life in a cell. He will never be released, and he will never see the outside world again. The Watts family murders didn't end when Chris was sentenced. The case became a national obsession. True crime forums dissected every detail. YouTube channels analyzed the police interrogation videos. Documentaries were produced. In 2020, Netflix released American Murder, The Family Next Door, a documentary that used Shanann's own social media videos, text messages, and police body camera footage to tell the story. It became one of the most watched true crime documentaries in Netflix history. But the media attention also brought something darker: victim blaming. Online commenters criticized Shanann for her social media presence, for her involvement in multi-level marketing, for her spending habits. Some even suggested she'd somehow pushed Chris to murder. Shanann's family was devastated by the harassment. They released statements defending her memory. They reminded the world that Shanann was a victim, that she was a loving mother, that she didn't deserve what happened to her. Neither did Bella. Neither did CC. Neither did Nico. In the years since the murders, Shannon's parents have worked to preserve their daughter's memory and the memory of their grandchildren. They've spoken out against domestic violence. They've advocated for victims' families. Because this case isn't just about one family in Colorado. It's about the dangers of living a double life. It's about the consequences of choosing violence over honesty. It's about the unthinkable evil that can hide behind a smile. Chris Watts didn't snap. He didn't lose control. He didn't act in a moment of passion. He made a choice. He chose to murder his pregnant wife in her sleep. He chose to smother his 4-year-old daughter while she begged him to stop. He chose to kill his 3-year-old daughter and hide her body in an oil tank. And he did it all so he could start a new life, so he could be free. On August 13, 2018, the world lost 4 people. Shanann Watts was 34 years old. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a mother. She loved her children fiercely. She worked hard. She believed in second chances. She was 15 weeks pregnant with a son she would never get to hold. Bella Watts was 4 years old. She loved school. She loved her little sister. She loved her parents. She trusted them to keep her safe. Celeste Watts was 3 years old. She had her mother's smile. She had a lifetime of memories she'd never get to make. And Nico Watts never got the chance to take his first breath. Their lives mattered. Their story matters, and they will not be forgotten. This has been the story of the Watts family tragedy, a case that reminds us that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes, it looks like the person sleeping next to you.